Welcome, everyone, to the Rad Friends podcast, where we take one question, one of life's thorniest questions. We recruit a rad friend and we try to deconstruct, explain, explore together. I'm joined today by my friend Lawrence Yo. Great to have you.
What's going on, Kate? I'm so happy to be here, man.
Oh man, it's so happy to have you here. So today's question, we're gonna hang a bit, but today's question, you can see in the show note if you want to drop straight to the question. Today's question is freedom overrated? But before we do that, great to have you here, Lawrence. What's going on?
We've had so many just conversations in general, like on the phone or in person, because we're both in LA. So, like when you told me you're starting this thing, and the way you prefaced it was, "Hey, it's just gonna be like pressing record, and we're just chilling, we're just hanging out." Then it was like the heartiest yes I could have given to a friend, and I'm just, yeah, really happy to chat with you, and I think this is a really good idea to do what you're doing here. So, yeah, man, I'm
Uh,
good. I'll be going to Korea in a few days, so I'm getting ready for all that. But other than that, it's been good just hanging out here with my daughter and family.
yeah, awesome, man. Well, tell us first. You were a big push for this because we have I say everyone has that friend where when you have the call, you see the phone ring, you're like, oh, this is gonna be 2 hours. It's just we just go down these rabbit holes. So you put I was like, well, what if I made this rabbit hole something that we shared with our friends? So thank you for that push. But let's start with okay. So you and I we share a lot of different interests in common. Hip hop, rap music being one of them. So let's say you're at like a record store, and someone turns to you and be like, "Hey, nice to meet you. How do you spend your time, Lawrence?" How do you answer that question?
Wow. Well, if we're in a record store, then I'll be looking for what that person is looking at, like what kind of records he or she is looking at. And yeah, that question of like how would I describe how I spend my time is such an interesting one. I think the thing that I would kind of approach it as like the things that I'm just most interested in, and then what are the things that kind of come downstream from that, like as a form of action. And, it's funny because me and you, we've been kind of just riffing on chat about this book that you actually recommended to me called Dilla Time.
Yeah.
And that book in itself just really reminded me. I actually haven't finished it yet, but I did pick it up. But it just reminded me of the moment in my life where I was making a lot of music and spending so much of my time in that space. And it was just a wonderful reminder that, at different points in my life, I could say that the way I spend my time, it has been quite aligned with what my interests are. And like when I was a musician a number of years back, like, even though I was spending a majority of my time making music and so forth, like I wondered what it would be like to play in the realm of ideas and stuff like that instead of kind of like trying to have music capture my emotions, right? And put that out there. So I guess this is a long way to say that I think if I were to describe what I do now to someone, I'd say, yes, I spend a lot of my time writing. I spend a lot of my time drawing. And I love to just think about what connects us as human beings and what are the nuances of the human condition that we could all explore together. And sometimes I use other art forms to do that, whether
Mm.
it's music or writing or drawing. But there's some mode of expression where that's the core of it. And then everything kind of comes as like a tributary of that. So, yeah, and by the time I finish that answer, that person will probably have left the store. But I'll be left talking to an empty record bin.
Oh man, but I love you say my activities are always downstream from my interests. That's a
Mm,
really and we're going to talk about freedom later. That's a powerful frame. I think we had another episode where we talked about following your passion and realized that passion is kind of this overused word. And
mm,
really, when oftentimes people say follow your passion, they probably mean follow your interests.
mhm,
And so it's just interesting that like you set it up that way. It's like I have my interest and how I spend my time is downstream from those interests versus people. A lot of people might, and often because they don't have the choice, spend their time doing a bunch of things and their interests are outside of it or up, adjacent or discombobulated. So I love that
Yeah.
framing, the kind of tributary framing of it.
Yeah, I like to think of it as also like you have so yeah, you have your interests and then kind of the activity comes downstream of that in terms of what you pursue and you could call it passion or what have you. But what's interesting is once you actually kind of immerse yourself in those activities, they help to inform why those interests were there in the first
Mm,
place. Because a lot of the time you don't know why your interests are there. Like you almost feel like you just have them in a certain
yeah.
extent and you don't know, like, "Oh, has this been conditioned into me in some way? Is this really what I'm interested in based upon my unique life experiences or what have you?" And what I find with something like writing, for example, is a lot of time it's just me figuring out like, okay, I think this is something that I am interested in naturally, but the more I write about it or the more that I think about it, it actually reveals some of the like blind spots in terms of, oh, I didn't realize that that interest was there for this particular reason. Like it didn't
Ooh,
just appear out of nowhere. But,
yeah.
like that's why reason people say if you don't really know what your interests are in terms of what you want to explore further. And there are people who say that, like, oh, I'm not really interested in many kinds of things that are actionable. Then I would always tell folks, like, well, just think about what you were doing as a kid, as a child. And when you just acted, that's what it is. You just acted on things. You didn't think about, yeah, is this something I'm interested in or not? You just did it without
Mhm.
any form of external rewards or any like carrot on a stick that's dangling you somewhere. You just move forward on it because there's something intrinsically interesting about that.
Yeah.
So, like, you could go back to what that source is. And, like, one interesting quote I heard was like, we live most of life in our first 20-25 years, and the rest of life is spent reflecting on those 20 to 25 years. Right.
Oh, oh man.
Um, yeah, like it's pretty interesting and how like I think in those early years you're just doing a lot of things to, without really questioning it. And then it's only later on where you get to think back on those formative years and kind of express yourself and try to figure out what happened within those first 2 to 3 decades of life and then kind of make sense of it and then take those lessons and apply that to like you with your adult responsibilities and all that stuff.
Oh,
So, yeah, I've kind of been thinking about that. I've been thinking about that quote a lot since I first heard it, and
yeah. Let's
it's
just say it again. You
so
spend,
like I think I'm paraphrasing here because
yeah.
I think the quote was like 3 sentences or something, but it was basically like life happens in the first 20 to 30 years of existence, and then the remainder of your life is spent reflecting on those 20 to 30 years.
Wow. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like there's a reason why when people go to therapy or when people are discussing some of the things that are at the brim of their mind when it comes to the problems that are really difficult for them to solve, there are always roots in one's upbringing or in one's insecurities that they had in high school. Like a lot of the things that we desired then, like they take different forms or shapes in our, like in our adult lives. And like without putting on some sort of psychotherapist hat because I'm not, but there has to be some sort of reason why things always flow back to
Mm-hmm.
our upbringing or our childhood. And there's something about that time in life that was so raw and unfiltered. And maybe like that is kind of represents some sort of essence. But
Mm,
what's beautiful is that that essence could be reshaped later through perspective or like you could view what that essence was at a different light and kind of create an entirely new identity as a result. But I think I would have to agree with the sense that there is something so formative about those first 2 to 3 decades of life
mm,
that really impact the way that you think. And the only way for you to even take a moment to reflect on those first 20, 30 years is if you had some sort of self-awareness in place during that time frame too, where you're like, oh, okay, I have the capacity to think about this deeper later. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think it's my issue, or the first thing that came to mind was exactly what you said. Is I spent the first 30 years of my life with very little introspection, but
Mm,
maybe that's confirming the statement versus because I feel very different in, from 30, I'm 44, 30, 43, from 30 to 43, I feel very different than even from 25 to 30 or 20 to 30. And
yeah.
so I do feel, so I feel like there's almost a snake shedding its skin type of thing, almost like a rebirth of sorts versus like shifting the compass, by a few degrees, like a complete transformation versus a reorientation. And maybe
Mm,
that's naive of me to think that like that the traditional life is one of like little tweaks over I feel like mine is more like like let's start this whole thing from fresh. So I feel like there's like, to some extent, sometimes I feel like I just started living like in the past 10 years, right? Getting
mm,
out of a lot of those scripts. But again, now that I think about it, that might actually be confirming that quote, not disagreeing with it, right? The other thing though that I heard as you were saying that is that formative, because you were saying like formative, it's like a formation of your essence, right? Like you and I are like talking about hip hop and fashion and culture and all that. Those are all parts of our childhood that that we're still attached to and that still bring us all these different, creative expression and meaning and so on. So there's the essence formation. If you think of yourself as a kid as this like block, right? A block of stone, and you're chipping in different influences of culture, of parenthood, of I don't know, education, things like that.
mhm.
But I think the other part that I see, and I don't love this word, but I'm going to use it, is trauma. And
Yeah.
I don't love the word trauma because, and I've been challenged, people have challenged me on this. I don't love the word trauma because to me, what I hear in the word is like really bad, extreme trauma, like, a physical abuse and emotional abuse and that kind of stuff. But I
Mhm,
do think about, and then I think, Gabor Mate calls it capital T trauma and small t trauma. And he
mm,
says, little t trauma is just feeling ignored as a kid, or little t trauma would be people making fun of your accent, right? And that would absolutely shape you as
mhm.
as a child. And so I think back to this story. This is a digression, but I was probably 12, and I was walking with my sister in New York, and we were followed. This was probably in like 1990s. We were followed by a
Yeah.
group of kids. Group of kids followed us, and in New York in the 90s, that never was a good sign. They followed us, and then they kind of started walking faster, and then they formed a circle around us and just like rifled through our pants and took our money and backpack, and I had a Walkman.
Mm,
And there's a part that says, people, if you live in New York in that time period, people say that was a rite of passage. If you were rich, poor, it might happen more frequently, less frequent, but it happened to every kid, some version of that story.
yeah.
And there was this part of me that's like, we were middle class, like that was it. That was just part of growing up. But I think back to that moment, like, and I think so much of my drive to this day was to protect that kid and say to that kid, you're never gonna feel that way ever again. Feel so unsafe, feel so unviolate, feel so violated. And I went to my parents, they were trying to make shit happen in New York. Like, I want to move. I hate this city. I want to move. Like, we can't move. Our jobs are here, or this or that, your school. And in my mind, and I had this resolve. I'm like, I will do whatever it takes to never put myself in that situation again. And so
Mm,
I guess I say that because it reminds me of, now I'm spending my adulthood kind of unpacking the essence, which I view as like a beautiful thing. Like, how did culture shape you? And then the trauma, which I view as a scary thing. It's like, what bad shit happened to you that you're still, trying to cope with 30, 40 years later?
so one thing I'm curious about real quick with that story, I just want to pause on is when you were saying, so in that kind of youthful state, in that logic you were having of, I want to make sure that that situation never happens
Mhm.
again. How did you envision how that you were going to do that? Or in what ways would you set up your life so that never happens again? Like, would it be through the cultivation of like money so you're never put in a situation where you're there in that particular surrounding? Or
Mhm.
like, was it physical strength?
So,
I mean, like, what was it really
it
that you thought?
in that situation, it was money.
Money.
Yeah, it was, I'm gonna have enough money to be able to live in a doorman building or a nicer neighborhood. I mean, it's no coincidence that, or maybe it's not a coincidence that I live in one of the nicer zip codes in LA. But I think it was at that time it was money, but I think it was that's like juxtaposition. So I associate money with safety very
Mm,
tightly, even though my physical safety feels very safe right now, you know? But it's
mhm,
still, I think that if I had to really deconstruct why do I think about money a lot, I think a lot of it might be shaped by that incident and others, not as not as egregious, but like it's in situations like that, like getting our car stolen, things like that. But that's it. So that's the tangent of, yeah, I think these childhood stories, right? It's they're pretty powerful. And I mean, I think of it with our kids too now. Like what we're trying to overcompensate, or I'm trying to overcompensate for some of the things that I felt like weren't given provided to me. But in
mhm.
doing that, it's like those squishy balls where you squeeze one end and just all the shit goes into like a different end. And
Yeah,
so like,
yeah.
what am I squeezing? I'm squeezing. What am I squeezing into the other end?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, these childhood kind of moments and these stories, it's like, and because I think the reality is if you were to think about your relationship with money and, like where like what events comprise the foundation of it, like it's probably so many things, right? But if I were to ask you consciously, there's something about your child, like our childhood, you go back to. I think this is y- somewhat universal in most folks. It's like if there's something that you're trying to discuss when it comes to your relationship with something or something related to your identity, and you ask someone, yeah, so if you were to guess, where would you point to as the genesis
Mm,
of that? Most people would share some story that happened within the first 20 to 30 years of their life.
mhm,
I mean, well, especially if they're under 30, but like, if they were to reflect back, they would try to tie it back to a childhood memory. And but I think the beauty is that you're right. Like, there is this element of transformation that can take place, and for sure, where it doesn't feel like this gradual progression of introspection, but more so like an epiphany or a wake-up call, and you have these various moments, and what you can then do is to not feel like you're a victim of whatever that memory may be, and then to kind of view the memory or the story as some sort of empowering force in many ways. And, like to some extent that can be a choice, but for others it may not. And it's just
yeah.
really, really hard to escape that narrative. But I would argue that your ability to be introspective and like you're saying that, oh yeah, you just were never introspective during those years and you're just kind of going at whatever you felt like you needed to do or whatever was hammered into you. I think that if we were to look at Kay's life with a fine tooth comb, right, and
Yeah.
then get up to that point, it wouldn't be like there was no tendency for introspection, and then there was. Like, I think there were certain things that could even tie back to other moments of your earlier life that within you there was this inherent sense of
Mm,
reflection, and these experiences you were having in your life kind of contributed to more doses of reflection that like compounded slowly over time until you're like, you know what, it's time to leave Wall Street or time to
mhm.
make some of these other big decisions. But I have a feeling there are mostly, if we were to look at things from a fine tooth standpoint, logical next steps than big leaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I that's my theory.
Hey, you raise a good point because we also tend to grasp as humans to the story, right?
Yes.
That and I actually wonder this, especially with people that put a lot of their lives online. Like that story, I've told it like 20 times in different
Mhm.
forms. And I think by repeating that story, it almost becomes a part of me. And I actually am
Right.
like almost disconnected from the source of the story. Like I've actually been thinking about asking my sister, like, do I remember this correctly? Because I've said the version that I either remember and or the one that I want to believe. This is like
Mhm.
the dangerous thing as like a public personality, a writer of sorts, is like you've created this like story of your
Yeah.
life and people are buying and buying into that story. And sometimes I feel very scared that I'm actually and whether you're aware of it or not, you're going to be influenced by how people respond, right? If you tell that story like,
Yeah.
"Oh my god," like you're gonna say it again or you'll believe it more deeply about yourself, whether it's a tiny bit or but do you think that if you tell stories over and over again that they like you start to reshape your own reality?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think and there's the reason why you tell a story again and again is because the response to it was favorable.
Mm,
If it was not, you
so
wouldn't tell
true.
it again. So so there is this inherent loop involved where because the feedback was positive and the feedback also came in response to how you tied that story in with a current philosophy or a current mode
Yeah.
of thought, right? Like because of that, this is how I think. And people are like, "Oh yeah, I like that connection." And that's a very
Mm,
powerful connection and it's a very vulnerable connection. So yes, that makes total sense. And then you're like, yeah, yeah, it does, right? And then like, of course, this you're not kind of like expressing this aloud, but I think this happens in the background.
yeah.
And this actually made me think of a really good short story by this writer named Ted Chiang. He's a
Oh,
science
yeah.
fiction writer.
The 3 body prop?
No,
Oh, that
that's Cixin Liu, but
oh,
Ted
okay.
Ted Chiang, he wrote an anthology of stories called Exhalation.
Oh,
And
yes, yes. One of
yeah,
them got
in
turned into
that
a movie, right?
no, that's Arrival. So one of the
Okay.
stories in there turned into Arrival, but he has another story called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, where he talks about like there's this technology and this has been shown in like a Black Mirror episode before, but I think his take on it is just way more memorable and interesting. But basically, it's like a technology that could record memories, right? And or it could record your day to day experiences, and you could recall them at any time. And he in this story, the protagonist basically he has this memory of his daughter, like, yelling at him a certain way, and, like, the pain he felt from that memory of, like, his daughter blaming him for his mother leaving her mother leaving or something like that, he thought that that was the reason why they don't have a good relationship, right? And this was the story that he always told people, he told his daughter and all that stuff, but he refused to, like, revisit that memory. But at one point, he had the chance to revisit it, and what he actually saw was that his daughter wasn't the one that said that. He actually blamed his daughter for the mom leaving, but
Wow.
he didn't remember that, and so the punchline of this story is once he found out about that, he told himself that that was not true. Like, he couldn't accept the reality of the memory because it ran so counter to his beliefs and his story of why him and his daughter weren't close. So he refused to believe that he was the impetus and he was the reason for that. So the what the story kind of showed me was that like it almost at a certain point, once you believe in a certain narrative, if the facts are presented to you in a clear-cut way with evidence, we will create another narrative that will override that because we're so bought into the initial story. And that is why I think initial stories carry so much weight, and are the way we construct the narrative of our lives is so weighted towards those earlier stories.
Hmm.
And maybe this is why childhood stories have such great importance.
Wow.
It's like that whole, Lindy effect with
Yeah.
Taleb and all that, but that applies to memories and stories
Wow.
where the older they are, the more we latch on to them, and the less we are able to and willing to let go of them or see the factual information that may convey otherwise. Like, you kind of don't even want to look at it.
Wow.
And perhaps that is why, yeah, stories, especially the ones that go back to then, are so powerful and they shape your reality. And it's and especially if those stories resonate with others and you're getting that feeling of, okay, yeah, not only does this make sense to me, it also helps other people make sense of their lives. And then as a result, you buy into it even more. And I think what ends up happening in a lot of those moments, especially people with influence and so forth, is that the power of that story becomes so ingrained in their identity, and your mind gets hardened quite quickly
Yeah.
if you're unable to, like, wrestle with whatever the opposing side may be or what the real situation may be. Yeah.
How does one get to the opposing side, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. It's really hard. It's I almost feel like it doesn't really matter what someone else tells you or the knowledge that you pick up from something else that may show you the opposing side or the opposing truth.
yeah.
You really just have to come to it yourself.
Yeah.
Like, I tell people that knowledge is not understanding. Like, no matter how much you read, no matter how much you pick up, or you try to shortcut your way to what you know through another person's thoughts and experiences, you can't fully embody and integrate that until you experience something yourself that gives you a glimpse of what that other side is.
Yeah.
And which is why, like, yes, I read a lot and I know you read a lot, but I also, like, don't really take those words that I'm reading too seriously. It's like I always have to contextualize it within that person's experiences, and I that's why I understand that in the end, I have to do my own thing, and at the same time, I have to be open to understanding that there are so many different interpretations and perceptions of any given experience that I have to
Ooh.
be willing to see what that other side may be. And
Yeah.
it's interesting on the topic of hip hop too. I just saw this interview with Kendrick Lamar, and the interviewer was like, yeah, what's one thing that you have learned about human beings, like, the most? What's one great lesson you've taken away? And he just said, man, that everyone has different perspectives. It's and that's the one universal thing. So yeah, I think it's just about an openness to experience and to understand that there is just so much more than what you contextualize in your day-to-day life. And I think the only way you could really do that is, first of all, you have to have conversations, like, with other people that you are aligned with and may not be
Yes.
aligned with. Like, there's so many different modes there. But yeah, that's where the starting point would be, I would say.
So that looks like a whole side conversation that we could go off on. But all right, let's pull it back into the topic du jour. All right. So we're going to jump into our question. And before we do that, just so our listeners know, we actually have groups of people, with myself included, discussing questions like this. So if you're interested in doing your version of the Rad Friends podcast, check out radreads.co/coaching. So today's question: is freedom overrated?
Bam.
So let you, I'll let you, I'll let you take it away. Maybe start with like some definitions, so that we're all like kind of on the same page of what we're talking about. But what do you hear when you hear freedom?
When I hear freedom, I hear the ability to spend your time and attention doing what your interests are centered around. So, tie it back to what we were talking about is you have certain interests and you have the ability to act on them. Do you have the capacity and time and attention to act upon your interests, to
Mm,
express your interests out into the world, or to even just do it for your own sake? Do you
mm,
have that? And can you also do it with the people you have chosen that you have agency over choosing to
mm.
actualize those interests?
Got it. Got it. So if I were to summarize, it's time freedom, you basically freedom, autonomy, right? Might be a way of saying that, as well as attention. That'll be an interesting one to kind of peel back because that could mean a lot of different things.
Mhm.
And then actually, actually it added a new one, which is the ability to, who would you say, like choosing who you interact with?
Yeah, or to work on some of these interests or to act upon some of these interests with people that you have chosen yourself,
Yep.
AKA what we're doing right now.
Got it. Got it. And so maybe for some context, I think like one very popular meme on freedom is the FIRE movement, right? So
Mhm,
FIRE is financial independence, retire early. And for those who aren't familiar, you get a high paying job, you don't spend any money, you invest really aggressively. And then at some point you have this, you do some math, like how long you think you're going to live. And then you live off of your interest or your investment returns. And so would you say that in freedom, there is a belief that more money buys you freedom? Like, where does that fit into the definitional landscape?
So it's interesting you bring up fire. So let's kind of use that as an example of this freedom dynamic in action and then some of the pitfalls that
Okay.
emerge from that pattern of thought. So with fire, there is this element of yes, you make a ton of money now. You dedicate. If you think about attention as a resource here, you dedicate that fully towards this pursuit of wealth in your earlier years, right? So you front load your attention spent on generating wealth, right? So that's what you're doing. You're kind of putting it all there. And then the theory is that you can then, after you do that, you can offload your wealth to spend your attention on the things you really want to spend on. All right. So fire accelerates this trend.
Mhm.
The problem though is that when you are so focused on something and some way of living in order to attain some future freedom, once that future freedom theoretically arrives, you can't just let go of all the habits and
Mm,
all the perceptions that you have had to cultivate within those years of chasing that freedom so maniacally.
got it.
So I've written before that basically habit is the glue that gives perception its stickiness. So
Whew.
it,
Those
in
are
the
some
sense,
bars, man.
yeah, it's straight. That's the thing, straight hip hop. You got to throw that into the writing too. And the thing is, when you and I've seen this pattern many times, whether it's through like people that comment in forums or even people that I know, where it's like you can't if you're checking your portfolio 20 times a day and you're meticulously tracking every expense and you're just you're every ounce of what you can do is just thinking about, all right, I got to hit this number. I got to hit this number. And all your habits come downstream from that goal. How plausible is it that once you hit this goal and once you can retire, that everything you just did, it just washes away and you're just completely, your attention is totally freed from all that stuff?
Mm,
It's very unlikely that that happens because, of course, we are creatures of habit. And even though you are free in that sense, the question is also like, okay, where did you direct that freedom to? Like, what were you chasing this whole time for? And I think that's an important question too, is like when we say freedom, we think of freedom as this universally good word, right? Like, okay, freedom is good, creativity is good, you know?
Mhm.
But it depends on what you already envision for freedom. Like, what does that
Mm,
even mean for you to be free?
mm,
And because it's not the ability to do nothing, right? It's because that in itself is why so many people that retire are miserable. Like there's good evidence behind that. Not to say that that's the case all across the board, but that happens quite frequently.
mm.
Now, if you know that freedom is to do something that you would have done in your leisure time, and if you had more leisure time, you would have spent more attention there. Well, then the question becomes, okay, how do you know that this new endeavor that you're dedicating all your time into won't become a game in itself?
Mm.
And this is kind of where we're starting to get to that question of, is freedom overrated? And I think freedom as a just concept and as a desire is universal. So I would say that freedom is not overrated, but, and I think everything that we're discussing now is the answer to that underline of but,
Yeah.
which is that whatever endeavors we engage in next, if it's not to do nothing, if there's something you're directing your energy to, tends to develop some sort of game around it. And are you equipped for that game? Whether that game is to generate attention or that game is to tell yourself that you're getting better. Are you making progress? And, like that's why people that, let's say, for example, you get into gardening and then gardening is something peaceful at first. And then, you try to grow out your garden more and more. You start looking at what other people are doing with their gardens. And, next thing you know, it could very well be the case where it's like, oh man, my garden kind of sucks.
Who's got the
And
bigger garden?
yeah, who's got the bigger garden? Who's like, whose fruits are looking ripe? And like these kinds of thoughts could also come in. So there has to be this notion of whatever you're accomplishing freedom for and you're funneling freedom towards, like that
Mhm.
in itself has to be free of any games in order
Mm.
for freedom
Wow.
to be that chief virtue that we so aspire to achieve.
Oh man, that's so many places to go there. So I guess the one I actually hadn't considered was, what is that? There's some saying, it's, you're the product of your activities or something, like basically like you are what you do, right? And
Mm.
so I hadn't even thought about I think the fire actually provides a nice kind of straw man to explore, or a prototype to explore here, because you spend 16, I don't know, let's say it takes 20 years to get financial independence. You spend
Mhm.
20 years being frugal, avoiding hobbies, not seeing your friends, not pursuing leisure, or only reading, books that make you on investing or what have you. To think that you can just push a button the day the portfolio crosses whatever, say it's 10 million bucks. The day the portfolio crosses 10 million bucks, you're like, I'm going to go have fun with my homies. Like it's a naive belief, because you have 20 years of conditioning to unlearn. Is that a fair kind of restatement of what you presented in that context to have it?
Yeah, I think, and you prefaced it well by saying that if we were to, and this could be a straw man, right? Like we're taking maybe the least charitable interpretation
Hmm.
of someone pursuing the fire movement. But I would say even if we were to go more into the charitable interpretation and just go with someone, let's say, is diligently pursuing fire, but understands that, okay, yeah, money's not everything, and I'm going to spend I'm like, I will splurge on trips with my family, and, like, I am okay to spend a lot of money, with certain things that really matter and all that stuff, but I think that when you are part of a certain movement like that, where the goal is so tangible, I think that's the thing where it's like there's like a number and there's this thing that you are climbing towards, then what you do and like how you shape your systems and things that you are doing in order to get there, these things cannot just be dismantled the moment you get there. And let's say, like we said, the most charitable interpretation is of someone that doesn't move the goalpost. They get there and it's done. So even in that case, though, there is, I would say, is a very low chance that, yeah, everything you have done before, it becomes a distant memory.
Yeah,
Like it's just something that you don't relate to at all. There is something about that conditioning that will continue to flow through. And maybe the next journey is you unlearning that conditioning. Maybe that's the next step. And maybe that in itself could be the thing. And maybe the way you do that is through art. Maybe the way you do that is through conversation
spirituality.
or spirituality or something like that. And I guess that wouldn't be too much of a far stretch either, right? It's like even the people that you talk to a lot where they are very, very wealthy and they feel like, yeah, I have so much money, but like what they're really end up kind of drifting towards is more the existential things.
Hmm.
And how is that going to help me address some of these habits that I've picked up and learned? I have everything that I thought I wanted, but there is that question mark about, okay, what next? Given that I have this, and I think that what next thing
Yeah.
is something that is embedded deeply into all of us.
Yeah. I see it often with the what next question. I think it's a fair derivative of it is this it? And so
Mm,
you hit the fire number, and let's back off the fire example because it is extreme, and it can be viewed as a straw man of sorts. But even if it's someone, I mean, a very very common thing I actually posted in the tweets today is freedom buys you the time to figure out all these. Let's just package them existential questions, right? So you take an extreme example: you're working 14 hours a day, you barely have any time to sleep, then you don't even have time to explore these questions. They're questions of fulfillment, of life satisfaction, of happiness, of love, of truth, of many other questions. So then like you end up landing back at the fireplace. It's like I don't have time to do that. But once I have the freedom of my time, then I will begin to explore these bigger questions of like what is happiness. There's no
yeah.
question necessarily there, but if how does that what do you see and what do you hear in that?
Well, yeah, I feel like there's a fundamental fallacy there. Like
Mm,
whenever I hear that argument of once you get there, once you arrive, then the clouds part and there is clarity for all the things that matter most in life. And until you get there, the clouds remain firmly closed and like you just see little glimmers here and there. And then that reminds you of, yeah, that's where I'm going to get to one day, except that ray of light will be much wider. I think that the fallacy is that, you know, if you always think that where your contentment will lie is contingent upon a certain situation, that once that situation arrives, like the arrival of being, like the feeling of being there, I think will inevitably just feel empty because you understood that this whole path was so conditional. Like there were
mhm,
so many conditions for you to get there. And this is also why I think about when people, for example, as creators are pursuing so much growth, for example, right?
mm. Guilty
Like
as charged.
I know we talk a lot about this stuff, and
Yeah.
here's the thing, like, I'm not impervious to but, like, this is kind of a thought I have when it comes to growth and, like, is this something to desire more of and so forth. I always feel that growth, it's, you know, you're always parlaying that into something else, right? Like, it doesn't happen for its own sake, it's always to do something else. So in a sense, if you're kind of pursuing growth, like for its sake, like when do you ever arrive? Is what I'm
Mm,
saying. When do you ever arrive? And if you don't ever arrive, like all you really have is the thing that you're doing now. Like that's the only place in which you could arrive. And I guess I see the same thing too when it comes to financial freedom or attentional freedom. If people weren't breathing down my neck so much, then I could just focus more on this or that, my kids or my hobbies. I would always say that like you should, if you can, to attempt some of the things that you envision now and understand what it's like to do it without condition and to get a feeling of what that's like. Because if that's the case, then that will show you like what your the purest of your intentions.
Mm.
And also because a lot of time people don't know what they want. Like they just think they should want something. And then when they actually get all the time in the world or all the thing they want to do, like they actually get it, a lot of times they're a little disillusioned. Like I felt this when I quit my job initially to pursue music full time. I
Yeah.
thought that I was going to have, oh, I need 40 hours a week to make music. So hell yeah, I'm gonna quit. But then like once I actually quit, I was like, oh, I'm not really making that much music. I thought I would want 40 hours a week to make music, but kinda sucks to spend that much time making music a week, but I naively thought that that's what I wanted, all the time in the world to do this, instead of giving myself more time, like, while I was working my corporate job to, like, spend extended periods of time doing this, wondering if this is even good for me in the first place.
With the music, because I think this happened all the time, and you actually were doing music and you wanted to do more music.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people haven't even started the thing. And that was actually that was an example was with I see this all the time with New Yorkers who move to LA is they're like, I want to be a surfer. I want to start surfing. I mean, surfing is one of
Uh-huh.
it's a little like fire. It holds this cultural ideal that that is very attractive, right? It says a lot about just saying I'm a surfer says a lot about you. I'm contrarian, I'm fit, I'm, laid back, I'm good, whatever, the label carries a lot of weight, I would say. People move from New York to LA and they say, I want to become a surfer. And they buy all the gear and all that. And then go to surf the first day and they're like, oh, the water here is gray, not green. Like next
Uh-huh.
thing they realize, it's really fucking cold. Like even in June, water's 61 degrees today. It's really cold. Oh, this thing's really hard, like really hard, skateboarding type hard. Then, oh, it's really lonely. Just because I could surf on a Tuesday doesn't mean my friends can surf on a Tuesday. I might not even have surf friends. And then there's another one. People don't say it, but I've tasted it. Is you can't put it on social. It's one of the few sports that you can't be. It's not Instagrammable. You'd have to be a douchebag with a drone or a cameraman, and no one is that. Oh, and the last one, it's subject to the whims of Mother Nature. So you got all these New Yorkers, these bankers that they've surfed occasionally, on surf trips and all that. And they're like, if only I could surf every day, I would be so happy. But they've never really done the thing. They get here within 2 months, they quit. They've given up. And so I ask you, like in your case, you at least knew the thing and you had more time to do it. Where was the disconnect or the letdown? Where did it not deliver?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold. I think, we could view it through the intrinsic motivation and the external validation kind of bifurcation. But I think one thing on the external side was I felt like, oh, this is my career now, or this is my job now. So I need to get people to listen to it and I need to, make this be viable. And so much of my attention went on like trying to grow my platform with my music, just like, and this was like during the blog era. So
Mm.
there were a lot of like hip hop blogs, and that was the way they were like the gatekeepers for distribution. So like I was spending so much time trying to find those blogs and like, and then like messaging them and submissions and like packaging my music so it's right for their submission criteria. And I even went to a record label out here, like inspired by some story I heard where I went with my music trying to like sneak it past the guard. And
Like the
yeah.
Kanye story, Kanye Pharrell or Kanye Jay-Z story.
Yeah, I think J. Cole did something like that too. So, like I was like, oh, maybe that's what I got to do. And y- needless to
Knowing
say,
you,
it
that
didn't
makes
work.
it so adorable too.
It was very adorable. It was super cute. Like, but like I needed to do it, I guess, to understand that like this is why it sucked. And
Mhm.
I found that my kind of obsession with getting it out there and putting so much pressure on myself that this needs to be a thing right away. Like, why else did you quit this like well-paying job to do this? That started to wear on my desire to make music. And then I think just intrinsically too, I think I've always been an idea person. I've
Mm.
realized is like I like sharing my ideas. Like when I go camping with friends, we actually like just hang around a campfire and just talk shop about all kinds of things. A lot of things that I wrote about, like would be things that I discuss with homies and stuff. And music is more of a time capsule for your emotions, especially if you're a beat maker. And I wasn't writing lyrics or anything like that. So it's hard to express ideas through music in that form. So I love the medium as a fan. And I loved how how beats were constructed and the art of it. And when I started dabbling in it, I thought that I loved it, and I think I did love it. I was in love with it, but I realized that there was a hard limit on how I could express myself the way I wanted to with music, which is why I probably didn't spend as much time as I thought I would there, because I was only expressing a part of myself to its fullest extent, whereas the other side I couldn't really touch too much. And as a result, the intrinsic side too wasn't quite fulfilled. So I think it was those 2 poles that were
Yeah.
just, like, pushing at me that made me kinda disillusioned with my path as a musician.
Hey, wouldn't you say that, but in that case, then having, so let's talk about quitting a job and the freedom that is the attention and time freedom that comes with that. So you quit the job, you try to do more music, you realize that that's not the thing. You also realize that you have these other interests or creative desires. And so maybe if in the freedom, the freedom bull camp, it's like, well, you needed the freedom to know that you had to either to know or to be able to express these additional desires. Is that is that fair?
Yeah. Like, yeah, I had the freedom to express what I thought I wanted for myself.
Yeah.
And I think that the missing variable there was that I didn't even know what I really wanted.
Mm.
I thought I wanted this, and I think this is where the argument for freedom starts to break down when when you chase it with the idea that you think you know what you want once you are free, without the experiential knowledge to back that up. And that's why I think like chasing freedom, it's similar to saying like you're chasing money. It's like of course money lends itself to freedom, but even freedom in itself, it there it has to be grounded in self-awareness, like a knowledge of what makes you excited, what makes you interested in various things. And I think that not enough time is spent on that introspection phase. But which is interesting because for you, like I remember you left Wall Street like without really knowing that you're gonna do the writing thing, like, so it wasn't even like you knew what you were going to do.
Mm-mm.
So in that case, for you, like was the freedom it was more about just the freedom to explore as opposed to the freedom to do what you want?
It's a great question. So one thing that is not always shared in my story was a tremendous amount of experimentation leading up to quitting. So I think I said this on the episode with Paul, but I had a New York culture blog. I tweeted anonymously in the early days of Twitter. I created a personal CRM in using like hacked Google Sheets. That was my like product management. I wrote all these business plans. So there was the pursuit of the thing, right? And I think the bet that I made on myself was if you can, and it comes back, we didn't use the word in this conversation, but in a different conversation, we talk about passion, aliveness is like what a lot of us are looking for. And I found that, as I imagine you would find that aliveness in music, I found that aliveness in these projects. And so the bet that I made was I can only do these six to 8 hours a week. What would happen if I could do this 40 hours a week? That was kind of the bet. And that's where I actually had the confidence because I knew I was willing to do the work. I knew there was a tapestry of activities that interested me. And I was just, and it excited me. So that felt like a really safe bet to make. In
Mm.
hindsight, it was accurate in the sense that the freedom gave me the ability to always tinker. I mean, look, I'm 8 years in. This is still a gigantic, what we're doing right now is a gigantic experiment. And, it helps that I have financial cushion to do it, but it has all the same questions that you had with music. It's like, the reality is not a lot of people are going to listen to this. The reality is I don't really know the reality is definitely not making any money. The
Mhm.
reality is I don't know where it fits into the business equation that is rad reads. So those are a lot of things that could stop me from doing it. But at the same time, if I optimize for aliveness, I'm like, yo, can't wait for this conversation, right? We just turn on two mics and two cameras, boom, talk for 2 hours. Then I have a trust that it will lead me in the right direction. So that would be one thing. But my own experience with freedom is like it gives space for that experimentation. So that's huge, huge positive. I'm lucky to have a decent amount of financial freedom is I can not make income for stretches of time and be fine. So that allows me to, again, I think it keeps, as I'm saying out loud, it keeps coming back to the space for experimentation. And I think one of my strengths as an entrepreneur is showing up. I'm not in my head. I don't overplan. If I have an idea, I just go and do it. And I think that
Mhm.
the combination of that with the freedom, time freedom and financial freedom is a delightful combination together. However, there's two things though. Actually, you were going to say something.
No, no, I'm
Oh,
just nodding along.
there's two things I would add to that. One, there's two poles in which we can take this conversation. One, you would talk about games. Careful of trading freedom for another game, like landing in a new game with newfound freedom. And then there's the freedom. This is more something I've been thinking about is there's a saying, money can only fix money problems. And I modified that to freedom can only fix freedom problems. Right. And so I think that I have a lot of problems, challenges that aren't freedom related. Right. There are conflicting relationships that I have with people that aren't at ease. There is the fact that I've been losing my hair for the past decade and I just makes me sad. Like freedom can't fix that. That's not a freedom problem. There is different insecurities that I have about whatever childhood stuff. Freedom. Again, I know someone listening to say, well, you have the time, you have the freedom to go address that. And again, I think that there's definitely truth to that. But at the same time, I never let people, when I coach people, I never say, I don't have time to work out. Like I've made it I've chosen to not make working out a priority. So if you don't have time to see a therapist, you've chosen to not make therapy a priority and you've prioritized something else. You might only have one other thing you can prioritize in your life, going to the gym, seeing your kids again. But I would challenge people. It's like, I don't know, you watch Succession, I think you have time for therapy, right? If you really wanted it. Again, kind of falling in love with the idea
Yeah.
versus the thing. So I don't know, which fork in the road do you wanna take? Do you wanna take the games fork, or do you wanna take freedom can only fix freedom problems?
I love this, man. This is
Choose
I
your own
love it.
adventure.
Yeah, yeah. Hold on, let me put my finger on that page and then see where the first one goes, and if I die, I'll go back, you know? Let's see. Okay, let's go to games.
Okay.
Let's start with games because both of those roads are fascinating. I think, yeah, the thing with games is that, yeah, if the prior endeavor, right? So if let's say achieving financial freedom was a game, okay? Like let's say you achieving freedom was a game in itself, and probably it was a game. Like anything
Yep.
with a tangible objective is a game. That's the way that I see it. Whenever the objective is very clear, it becomes a game. And also if there are people that share that same objective and are further along towards that objective than you are and are sharing that, then it's also a game. Like there's certain rules here involved. So you have tangible objective, different people along various paths to that. And then the third is people are sharing their what they know along this path. Those three things combined together forms a game.
Yep.
So the the trick is that whenever you become free to do whatever you want to do, and let's say that let's say it's completely disembodied from anything that looks like the pursuit of wealth or the pursuit of status or anything like that. The thing is that I think that the other variable here, aside from those three things, is also the game of the self and the game of the inner critic. And this is something that I wrote about recently of just how, when it comes to the phenomenon of burnout, it's not really an external response to events. It's actually the result of inner exploitation and this belief that you're not doing enough and that you could always be progressing. You could always be moving forward. There's always a barometer that you're comparing yourself to that you could surpass. And in a weird way, like that's empowering. And at the same time, it could be very debilitating. So when you're when you're playing this kind of if you are playing a game with these variables involved, I think, this is where we're going to start to venture into platitude territory, but we have to kind of start there before going into more nuance. But like, I think freedom is really tied to that sense of enoughness. And I think it's not enough from a tangible standpoint, but there's like this faith you have to have that you like we were mentioning earlier, I like how this kind of ties back to there's like this essence to you that can be preserved without the need for having to accomplish or achieve something in the same way that we have for a child. Sadly, this is only made the most apparent, I'm guessing, when you are a few yards away from death. And it's really hard to do when you are miles away from it. So I think the question is like, how do you cultivate that when you're in a space where there's always more you could be doing? There's always some texture of progression you feel like you need to go towards. And I
Mhm.
think it kind of ties to what you mentioned about this freedom you have to experiment. It's like if you had this freedom to experiment, but you didn't have to tie this at all into any of the questions you were asking earlier about like how does this fit into the equation of rad reads as a whole? How does this, like how do these things happen? How am I going to solve this? Like I know for now this is fun, but like there's this looming question of like how does this become something else? Like I think an environment without any games is where all those questions are silent.
Mm.
And it's only like I am here because like I just love to tinker and experiment. And it's the tinkering that makes life so worthwhile, and it feels like it's devoid of any games. just that in itself. And because when you truly are tinkering, you're not comparing what you just did, not just with what someone else has done, but even with what a prior version of yourself has done.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I think that's the only way this could be completely game independent. And I think there are certain variables that have to be satisfied in order to play that game, or in order to transcend games entirely. And it's like kind of two paths here where it's like, one is through money, because like money can basically open, you could close all the doors you don't want to open. And you're like, I just want to walk through this one. And like, I just want to do that alone. And the other is some form of like spiritual transcendence and some form of enlightenment or some form of path that basically it you are agnostic to the whims of these kind of comparisons and secular things. But even that path
Yeah.
is tricky because people there is an advertising of I am this. There is hierarchies of gurus and people that teach. So that in itself is also not super clear cut too. But the way I see it is, yeah, any kind of transcendence of games, there has to be like either a transcendence of self, or if you want to live in a secular culture and be okay with that, then money has to kind of free you of all that.
Yeah.
But it could only solve money problems too at the same time. So
Yeah. I it's it's the games thing really resonates because when you and I talk, I'm closer. I like the game. Like there's a part of the game. I think fundamentally, I wish I didn't like it, but I like it. And I think there's a lot of deep self exploration around that. You have always struck me as someone that can kind of keep the game at a healthy arm's distance. And it seemed, you get seduced by it here and there, but you have I feel like you have a very healthy relationship with the game. And I go like, the game kind of like slaps me around. It's like, you want this? And like, it's like an abusive partner. It's like, you want me, but don't like, I'll let you drift a bit only for you to realize how bad you want me.
Right.
And so I feel like I have that relationship with the game. And I think a huge part of it is what you said. It's a question of self, right? I think it is at its core, this need for progress drives, and I think the West has just turned, just, it has, the West and the internet have just turned that just on overdrive in every possible way, like there's gurus teaching gurus how to guru, right? That it doesn't get more absurd than that. But I think it does come from this fundamental belief that we have about ourselves, that we are not, I don't know exactly what it is, like we're not worthy of love, we're not good, or our self-love. I know we're getting into some like woo language, but it feels very much like the love that we have for ourselves as individuals is conditional on progress.
mhm.
And when you set up that game, it's like everything else it's just you never get, it's the constant arrival trap. You never get there. And because your essence is staked on that principle, then burnout, suicide, I mean, you name the mental health crisis. I suspect that a big starting point is that we don't conditionally accept ourselves. We don't unconditionally accept ourselves for who we are. And thus all of this striving is to make ourselves feel whole, but it never, the starting point is flawed. So you actually never get to the destination.
Yeah. I mean, that's very clearly put. I think that is the conundrum here. And, you know, I think the thing to consider with certain things like self-love and all that stuff too is like there is this element of kind of humility involved in all that as well, in the sense of, let's say if we were to, like, let's say, okay, you're kind of like independent of games. You've gone beyond games because you have this wholehearted acceptance of self, and you're like, hey, I know I am worthy, and it's not just knowledge, but it's pure understanding, right? And then it like flows through you and courses through you. The question I would have is that like, okay, so can we, even for that person, can someone understand that they have arrived? Like
Mm,
this is it, you know? And the this is itness, can that prolong to perpetuity, right?
mm,
It is, or is at a certain point you are bound for that this is itness to become suffering. And like, is there something just fundamentally baked into us that just doesn't allow for that state to happen in perpetuity?
mm.
Is like one thing that I've been thinking about. And I have this inclination that it's probably not. Like you can't persist in that state. And I think it's because we are so invigorated by challenge. There is just, and you mentioned aliveness, like that word in itself is so dependent. It's upon these two conflicting things. So this aliveness is like,
Mm,
it's a combination, it's a sum of you feeling like you're enough and then also you feeling like you're challenged.
mm.
But those two things conflict. Like
Yeah.
it's difficult to make those two things cohere.
Yeah.
So yeah, that notion of, if you to feel challenged, like how do you feel challenged without like, while at the same time knowing that this is it, is the thing.
Yeah. Well,
And
I think yeah, sorry,
yeah,
cut you off.
no, go ahead.
I mean, maybe that's the whole thing about human consciousness, right? A dog can lay on their and is the dog's not thinking about therefore, tomorrow. It's just like, I'm laying, I want to eat, I want to play, and I'm gonna go lay. And I think the human brain, the human consciousness, we project the future, we yearn for the past, we have desires, we have fears. It's like it's almost like that cocktail of humanness, which is why you and I jive at so many levels. Is all of these questions are just Trojan horse for the human condition,
Mm,
right? And so when I heard you say, you might not be saying this, but what I heard is that the human condition, by definition, makes it so that we never find true equilibrium, right? That's my interpretation of it. It might not be exactly it might not be what you meant.
yeah, or if you touch that equilibrium, the only way for you to appreciate that equilibrium is to go off balance again.
Mm,
And
yeah.
like there is something that we require a little bit of turbulence in order for us to even know that we're at equilibrium, and then to also appreciate that we're there for a moment. And like that's why I always say that, wisdom is the coexistence of contradictory truths, is to understand that there's, no matter what position you take, there's an equally poignant truth on the other side. And it's only to be aware of that where you're kind of, you understand that there's some sort of balance here, and then you feel like, oh, okay, like this is a little glimpse into what is really happening. And I think whenever we have like small hits of that, whether it's through experience or something that we read or something that resonates, like we feel this sense of kind of peace.
Yeah.
And what contributes more to that sense of peace is like, okay, now that I know this stuff, I'm going to challenge what I just learned and what I know, and through the form of expression, through the form of art. Like art is challenge. And then like when you're in that state, you're like, oh, okay, now you're kind of looking towards like what project you're working on, how it's going to be finished. You're a little, like you're not completely okay with enoughness, but you are doing this to understand like this is valuable and this is what makes me feel alive. And that helps you kind of go back to balance again. Like it's like this push and pull dynamic between the two. And like that's why I think there is no answer to this, but there's not meant to be an answer.
Mm,
Like all we're meant to do is to keep asking the questions, and like that's what matters most. It like people that want the answer, it's like a person that goes to a 2 hour like Marvel movie and they're like, why did I watch that? Like I knew exactly how it was gonna end. Like the good guys are gonna be fine. But it's like, yo, that's not the point of going to watch a movie.
Yep.
It's not about like the ending. It's all about like the entire process, like what it was like to feel and go through the motions of all that, empathize with characters and their plight. And like that is what makes it beautiful. So like someone listening to this may be like, man, like all these dudes are asking our questions and they're not giving us like the tweet, you know, like what's at the finish line here? And it's like,
Mhm.
yo, that's not the whole point of it. And like the whole point of writing of any art form is like you're just asking more and more questions and trying to frame what has already been asked, you know, because this is like at the core of what we do, but just in like different angles. And like, I think that's what a good story does anyway in the first place.
Mhm. And I think it's funny as you're saying that because we had the two forks in the road. One
Mm.
was the games, and the other is that freedom can't fix freedom. Freedom can only fix freedom problems. But we actually collapsed the paths because it's kind of like the f- the problems that freedom can't fix are the problems of the self,
Mhm.
right? Whether it's that sense of lack or that need for progress or the destabilization, restabilization, whether that's a prompt, whether that's a bug or a feature, everyone will have their own interpretation of it. But
Mm.
do you think we circumvented into freedom can't fix? Or we like round we snuck our way into freedom can only fix freedom problems?
Well, so what were some of the examples you mentioned about the things that are not freedom problems?
It's like difficult relationships.
Difficult
Um,
relationships. Do
like
you
if
think that
you,
is not a freedom problem? Like, what about it makes it not a
mm,
freedom problem?
well, usually it's people that you can't be free from, right? Like family.
Mm.
I mean, I guess theoretically you could. It's funny, right? That's actually a freedom, it's a quasi freedom question, right? If you don't get along with your brother, freedom is I'll never see you again. I'm free from you.
Mm.
But some some might argue you can never be free from your own sibling, right? Again, I don't have I don't have opinion on that, but that would be one thing. So I would say like relationships or challenging relationships would have been one. I don't
What
think I
would you say
said
to the
it.
person that says what would you say to the person that says, like, "Well, if you had the freedom, like, to like, if you had the time to figure it out, like, then you can, you know, like, have more
Mm,
conversations, or you could take them on a trip and you can go hang out." Or do you think that it goes beyond experiences you could have shared together and something much more fundamental than that?
I think I think that it definitely goes beyond. I think I would say a few things to that person. I'd say one is the same thing. It's like going to the gym. It's like, well, why haven't you done it now? Like, you don't need freedom to take the first step now. That would be the
Mm.
first one. But I think the second one might be that I don't know. Let's say your I'm just saying a brother here. I don't have a brother, but your brother is emotionally abusive to you. You might not have any more freedom. Doesn't make more time to spend with your brother won't change the fact that he's emotionally abusive. Right. So there's some things where I guess that's in my mind. I would say like that's not a freedom. Again, the only freedom would be severing the link, being like, I'm never seeing you again. I'm free from you.
Mm.
But I don't think people would view I don't- it's not the traditional definition of freedom. Like, oh, I have more. It's not the freedom we've been discussing, time freedom and attention freedom.
Yeah,
The
yeah. No,
other
I think your intuitions are right there.
the other one would be I didn't say it would be the fear, like your fears, but let's go to the big one is the fear of death, right? That might be even if you're afraid of your own death, having more freedom might actually make the problem worse. You have more
Mm.
time to think about your pending demise, right? And I think I don't know how common it is, but it definitely in our listening community, the fear, some version of the fear of death is legit fear. And we could say, is it ego death or is it, we can deconstruct that in some other episode. But if you're afraid, and I say this from experience, like for a long time, I've had a fear of death. And the fear of, if you have a fear of death, having more time or more attention or more money generally doesn't free you from that fear. As I say that though, I recognize the inconsistencies. I have a much lower fear of death than I did 8 years ago.
Hmm.
So I would say it's probably through my creative expression, like writing about this and being like, well, what does death even mean? Is it physical death, ego death, spiritual death, things like that? But I have had time to talk to therapists and go on retreats and stuff. But again, I don't think that I think I'm an outlier in that is like that was always in me and just having the time like broke the dam open. So that would be that would probably be another one. I think initially I'd said, if you're insecure and if you have low self-esteem, is freedom going to give you more self-esteem? Again, you could like buy freedom, buy therapy, etc. But
Yeah. I don't yeah, I don't think that, like, in your case with the fear of death thing and being more open, I think just being more open to explore that was probably the main thing. It's like you feeling like this was an avenue of expression to talk about your thoughts on it. And I think a lot of time these fears and there's this interesting thing where if you just communicate what you think about it or your thoughts about it, that's almost like that's more than half of the source of your fear is that you haven't talked about it enough or you haven't addressed it enough. And then there's something also powerful about, let's say you're writing about it, knowing that you'll share it with at least one person, because then that forces you to like not just be like a madman and just like, writing about death like you don't care about what the other person thinks. It's that you're taking your time to really like sit with it for a bit, and you're trying to thinking
contemplate,
of you. What was that?
contemplate.
Yeah, yeah, you're contemplating it and you're kind of reflecting on it, and then you're like, all right, I'm gonna present. Here's my presented thoughts on this, and you could also revisit it later as kind of like this artifact of what you thought at a given moment. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about writing is that it kind of you're presented with a clearer version of yourself, at least for that piece. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, I'm capable of thinking that when it comes to this topic. And like when it comes to the fear of death, like it's not just about death itself. Like the fear of death is always tied to other things.
Mhm.
So I think the key there is to connect it with other elements that highlight what that fear of death does when you know there's a hard limit on your life. Like what does that do for everything else? And maybe like 8 years, you're 8 years older than you when you were like really struggling with this, and maybe for some people, as they age, the fear gets stronger, but other people, it gets less. It's like
Yeah.
this awareness that, hey, there's this inevitable finish line, and because I've thought about it more, you could accept it a little bit more as time goes too. But you're right. Like having more time to think about if you have a proper way of making space to communicate your thoughts on a fear, then actually freedom does help you quite a bit, or having that free time and free attention to do that helps. But if you only spend it distracted from some of these fears and to do everything you can to run away from them, then it's gonna
Yeah.
bite you in the ass.
It's on.
Yeah.
Oh man. Damn. All right. We're coming up on, God, 90 minutes. So where do you think we landed on it
Oh
all?
wow.
If you think about freedom of time, freedom of attention, let's do a little recap.
Yeah. So the question is freedom overrated? I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
If I were to choose between yes or no. It would be no. I think it's something that it's worth pursuing, and I think it has very good benefits to be able to have free attention and time to the endeavors you care about. I think, but you have to know yourself. Yeah, you have to know what you want using that freedom, and you have to know what your fears are, because if you do have that freedom and attention and there are unaddressed fears, they can just grow larger if you don't invest that attention towards thinking through that. And yeah. I mean, we're creators, so I think we're biased towards creativity, but,
Yep.
like, I feel like if you have found some sort of art form or creative form of expression that allows you to think through these things and know yourself better as a result, then having the freedom to explore that and experiment with that is definitely a net positive. And with the caveat, of course, that there are games that surround this space. And these games could take you from what you once thought was very enriching to a source of I'm not doing enough, or I'm not good. I'm not as good as this other person, or so forth. So, but I think a lot of that is alleviated when you take time to know yourself better.
Yeah.
So eh, I think that's kind of the kernel there that this all stems from.
I love that too, because it's kind of, it's like, freedom overrated? No. But if you didn't dedicate time for self-awareness before you had more freedom, chances are you're not going to do it when you have more freedom.
Yeah.
And in that regards, you will, whatever challenge you had prior to the freedom will persist post the freedom, because these are, so many of these questions are self questions. So using that self-awareness, and I think this is, oh man, this makes me so happy, because I think it's just it's like a beautiful, simple conclusion. It's like you don't need to fire,
No.
right? You just dedicate a couple minutes, a couple hours a week to some process of self-reflection, self-awareness, right? Because that's the unlock, that's the unlocking, it's the door that opens the other doors, right? And then
Yeah.
more freedom, yes, you can open more doors. But if you never open that door, chances are with more free time, you're not going to open that door, because it was something else that was preventing you from doing it anyways.
I think that's a great summary. I think that's a good distillation of it. Totally. So, yeah, like we were just describing earlier, that a capacity for self-reflection and to just ask yourself a couple key questions whenever you can that allow you to delve a little deeper into that. Even asking this question, hey, use some of these rad friends questions
Yeah. No,
as
that's the point. That's kind of the subversive point of it all.
yep. So use that as a starting point, give yourself a little bit of time to address them, and then I think that's a good place to start.
Oh, my man. Well, we always, before we sign off, we shout out an up and coming artist, creator, writer, thinker that's on the come up. Anyone you got for us?
Yeah, I think of this YouTuber. Actually, she draws a lot. She does a lot of stuff on creativity, and she draws a lot of like sketches and kind of shares her thoughts on yeah, what it means to live a creative life. Her name is Noor Majid,
Okay.
and she has a channel called Design Draw Do. I like that channel, and she just like she has a very calming, soothing voice, and she just like kind of walks you through some of her drawings, but at the same time explaining what like yeah, what various like how creativity fits in the context of her life, and kind of like how others could view it in a similar light. And I just like what she shares on the topic of creativity. So she's someone that
Oh,
I'd like
love
to
it.
highlight.
Love it. And what about you? Where can we go see your beautiful art? I'm not kidding when I say that. Your writing.
You could go to moretothat.com, and yeah, that's where my online home is. So you could just go over there and check out my stuff. I'm on Twitter too. More to that, not as much, but you could find me there as well.
And definitely sign up for the newsletter so you get all the posts.
Yes. Sign up for the newsletter there, and if you sign up for it, then you'll probably see a dialog box come out, and maybe a case face will be on there too. I think they, like, rotate things out now in the
Oh,
Creator Network,
nice.
but yeah, you might see case face pop up there too.
Awesome. And you on mine, our newsletter as well. All right, rad friends, Lawrence, and everyone listening. Thank you all. This has been a phenomenal episode. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye.